Hi, welcome everybody to the May 10th Planning Board. We tend to start, as those you who know, with a kind of a training session from 7 o'clock to about 7:30ish. So we're going to do that now. John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. We discussed last time having an open discussion about what sort of training ideas and that you might have for future sessions. And we thought we'd do that today. I did want to update you on the Main Street Advisory Committee report, the Access Committee. They issued an advisory report to the council and presented it 2 weeks ago, I think, on Monday. And you've seen most of it in parts over time. We've previewed it, got feedback. We had a long session with the city council. They were receptive. You can see Main Street's being striped, presumably with the recommendations of the Access Committee in mind, to get more spaces out there. So if you have any questions, it's online. It's not on the city website, except if you look at the workshop agenda for that night when the presentation was done, you can see it there. If you're curious, I can send you a copy or whatever. But if you have any questions or whatever, otherwise I think we should move on to, a discussion of what sort of training sessions you might want in the future, or what sort of discussions, or how do you want to play with the first half hour of your next meetings?
Well, let's kind of go around the board and see how everybody feels. Sorry.
I'd have to say I find things like your updates about the Main Street Access Committee very helpful, because I don't have the bandwidth and the time to figure out what else is happening on the city level. So that is, I think affordable housing issues is something that would interest and be helpful to me as a member on the board. If there are ways that we can coordinate with efforts on the county level. I know there's I just did a webinar on affordable housing in the county, and there seem to be some interesting opportunities coming up down the road in the not too distant future.
Yeah, the county just finished a housing needs assessment for all the communities.
Yeah, that was the webinar.
Dutchess County, yeah.
Yeah. That's all that comes to mind right now, but as the board goes through, I'll ponder some more.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I happened to see that in the agenda, and I read the housing report, and it included a lot of stuff that I didn't know whether any of that research had been done, like the analysis of how much housing exists, what the demand is, and then sort of following the whole arc through where they were talking about what the affordable housing commitment, they had a certain term that they used for each community in the county might be, and so there were actual numbers, there were goals that they generated. Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert to know if it's precisely, there's differences of opinion of how they came to that number, but I thought it was really helpful, and that there was kind of a number given, right? That if we, of a community of 12,000 that has a certain amount of affordable housing now, this is, if we want to contribute to helping the problem with the expensive housing, this is what you can do. This is the burden that you should bear as a community in order to help out your citizens. And I thought that was really useful. And it was like 5 units per year, something like that, and 200 units over another period of time. Tell me if I'm wrong with the numbers, but it seemed like an achievable number. That if we planned it and thought about interventions, either subsidized housing, there are many, many ways to do it, and there are people with expertise in that field that we can be pretty certain that it's going to actually have an impact to help people based upon all the experience that people have working in this. So any further information detailing other communities' experiences, right, and the outcomes, I'd love to learn more so that we can focus our efforts.
I was surprised how low the numbers were, because I think the need is much greater than those numbers represented.
Yeah,
That was weird.
that
And
was-
East Fishkill had like 4 times the amount of demand, and it might be they were using some sort of multiplier of like how much they've done already, right?
I think it's the distribution. Yeah,
Yeah.
they were trying to work out distribution and lack thereof
So there's-
historically.
They're trying to distribute the number of units over the entire
Yeah,
30 communities, and the ones that have lower numbers now are expected to do a little more in the future. And Beacon has a lot of affordable housing units as a
Right.
percentage of its
as
total
does
population.
Poughkeepsie.
Right, but I mean, there's other aspects to it, which is that because it's potentially, you can potentially live without a car someday.
Yes.
Or with fewer cars in Beacon, that it's in some ways more affordable, and that that there's a benefit to having that broad range of housing pricing in Beacon for a lot of different types of incomes. Because in East Fishkill, you have to have a car, and if you're a family, you need 2 cars. And it's difficult to be poor in the country, I think, anymore, I guess is what I'm saying, in the suburbs. And there's many benefits in denser communities.
I've seen these housing studies come and go, and they always project, the town of Washington and the town of, Unionville and some of those more rural communities. And it never happens out there. And it really maybe shouldn't, because they don't have the transit services and they don't have the proximity to grocery stores and the things that you really should to have supportive services for affordable units. So that doesn't happen there. More likely to happen in the cities and in the tight-knit suburbs and villages. And so, if I was projecting for Beacon, I would project a higher number in terms of need, just based on the escalating rents, for one thing.
Lynn, please.
And I think, to some degree, hearing reports of what the Main Street Access Committee was doing served this purpose, but I would like in the future to continue to get training on innovations or lessons learned from other communities, whether it is about, Main Street preservation or just enhancing, the walkability and livability of cities, but to get a kind of a steady feed of innovative solutions or ways of looking at problems, so that we're kind of just keeping up with our peers around the country. And even if it's a little bit, maybe, even if it seems a little bit too innovative for us to consider, I'd still like to know, where the zeitgeist is, what's happening, so that if there's something that we become aware of and we're like, hey, we need to do that here, or we need to look at that strongly here, we maintain an awareness of what the state of the practice is. That would be real useful. And something that's maybe even something that we could distribute the research responsibilities a little bit among the board if it takes a little more effort to do it.
Jill?
What was the question?
Just our training.
What would you like to see?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with the housing study and the Main Street stuff. What was yours?
Housing.
Housing, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'll have to think about it.
Okay. J.C.?
Are we asking, are we asked to respond to the Main Street Access
No, we're
report?
asking,
or
what
just
would we
gen-
like to see at training?
Future training.
Future
Right,
training.
right,
Topics.
understood.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to comment on the Main Street Access report because I was on the committee, so I know how much work was put into it. I was on, and they met weekly, and I would encourage the city residents to actually read the report. It's 24 pages, has a lot of information about the history, and personally, I think more training about the history of Beacon could be helpful. There's a lot of information there about how Main Street changed over time, urban renewal changes, even just where Matawan and Fishkill Landing were separated. I didn't know that myself. It's North Chestnut Street is pretty much the border between the two towns. So a lot of interesting history in that report that I think residents would benefit from reading if they're going to, you know, sort of ask or respond to the changes that were proposed and why those changes were made. So again, I'd like to thank the committee for doing that report. I thought it was valuable. That's it.
Jill, any?
They're all really good suggestions. Something that popped into my mind listening to all this was I believe it's a William Faulkner quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And the implications for that in terms of acknowledging Beacon's past and what it means for planning for the future. So, and that impacts all these things. So I think the linkage zone is a really good example of that. From when it was, from my understanding, primarily an African-American community that was bulldozed during some misguided urban renewal during the 70s, is that correct?
Mostly 70, yeah.
Yeah, and never rebuilt, or basically the community was never rebuilt to the way it was. And when we first moved to Beacon 18 years ago, my husband and I, and our house backs up to a house that was owned by the former pastor of the Springfield Baptist Church. And we heard from her daughter that there was still some bitterness there, that they had torn down their church there and really disrupted the community, which is still a very vibrant community, and they have the building here and now. But just the way that the built environment really is such an important part of building the otherwise invisible community aspects of living in a city, in a small city.
You may have to speak up a little bit.
I would say that something that I think is very important as part of the overall structure, what everybody's saying, is understanding the balance between what the board's capabilities are, and so that the community understands what our limitations are, because we have different previews. Everyone looks at things from a different optic view. And I think as the training happens, I think we need to understand those borders and those guidelines. They have to be very clear, because a lot of these things are very emotional, very impactful, and our board's power and our function is limited to a specific scope. And I think we need to always understand that and respect that, and so that the community can also understand that as part of what our training, and furthermore, as far as our impact to be able to help to initiate certain smart growth, smart changes. I think that becomes very, very important. And I think that as the board grows and becomes more members of the community and other people come, they could also take that on as a baton. Because I think one of the interesting things from a learning standpoint, looking at my tenure here, where we have come to where we are right now, the things we need to understand and learn has greatly changed. It significantly has shifted. And I think we need to stay in lockstep with those shifts while we look at and then address the things that become challenges that we face as a community changes. And I think that takes in consideration our past, our present, and as best as we can looking towards our future. So I think those things need to be part of the collective learning process so that we always stay within our own scope of what we can do. So, but John, I'd like to get Mr. Russo's thought on what things you think would be very helpful for us. Because what's interesting, you know, our professionals are kind of in this interesting space. I'm saying this to the community also because we often rely on them to give us recommendations, but I think they kind of operate in this mystical box And people really don't understand what that is and why that becomes an important. So I think, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, Randall, I think you had a very good point, understanding the board's limitations. I mean, you're exacted to do a job with codes that have been set by others. I think what everybody has said as far as the affordable housing, Main Street, how things are developing, you may not have say in everything, but you can discuss those with projects that come in to maybe help implement some of that. Other things that we've been getting more into is the traffic impacts. Yeah, your city, you'd like to have a walkability to get around, and yeah, you have a train station right down below. The traffic coming in, when I came off the bridge, was backed up at least 4 blocks right now. So traffic is one thing we're looking at. As far as the environment, we're dealing with one project where we have wetlands, disturbance to wetlands, and mitigation. The board has made it very clear that they want to see that mitigation occur within the city for the benefit of the residents. Stormwater is a big impact. The utilities themselves, water, sewer, what do we have available to people? And what improvements can we do to the system to improve everything for everybody?
Yeah, the one other thought I had was, I feel like if there's a way that we can have better, or see if there's other, or what models are out there for interacting amongst different agencies in the city, because I feel like, for instance, we have a climate smart coordinator now who we could be getting, information from on the vision that they're creating on what we need to do to make sure we're a resilient community in face of environmental changes that I think would be important for us to bear in mind as projects come up.
Did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
Nope, thank you.
John, final words on that?
Well, I think myself that the hottest topic and the greatest need is affordable housing at this point. And I think maybe I'll try to do something at the next meeting. The mayor instituted this at the beginning of this year, maybe it was the beginning of last year, sort of a whole laundry list of suggestions. And the council was supposed to take these up one at a time and go through them, and it got kind of bogged down and never really went anywhere. Now, the city is looking at its parking lots, its public holdings, and trying to come up with solutions where they can provide parking on the ground level and take care of the air rights, build 2 or 3 stories up over the parking so that they can do affordable housing designated, work with developers the way they worked with Westland Loft to create affordable housing in central locations where we have parking lots now that are unproductive and, a drain on the tax base instead of a useful part of the city. So I think I'm working on, when I'm not working for you, I'm working on those sorts of scenarios, what the Churchill lot would look like if you could increase the number of parking spaces on it on 2 levels using the hill and putting housing above it. It's in a prime location. You could double the number of spaces and have housing units, a mix of affordable and market rate housing units on that site as well. Same for the Henry Street lots.
At least with Churchill, topographically, a structure like that would be a little bit kind of diminished in terms of its impact. It's still, you're between Main Street and the Ridge Line, but, when I hear about, residential structures on top of parking garages, and I start envisioning those at places like Henry Street, or, I have a visceral reaction that isn't positive, it just kind of, from an aesthetic standpoint, which is not the most important thing in the world, but
Well, there's ways to do it, though. There's, and this could be a topic too. How do you deal with parking structures and not have them look like layer cakes of parking lots. There's green facades, there's historic facades that have been put on, examples from around the country I could show you. What a lot of people are doing now are liner buildings, 18, 20-foot wide residential units that are on the edge of the parking structure, and line it so that it looks like a housing development, but the interior is a layer or two of parking. So there's a lot of different ways you can deal with structured parking, and it helps pay for the parking. You know what? Parking itself is a drain on the economy in a lot of ways. There's no such thing as free parking. The citizens of Beacon are paying for the parking that's out there. There's over 9 acres of land that's publicly owned that's devoted to parking lot within walking distance of Main Street. 9 acres is a huge amount of value in central locations.
We've probably talked about this before, but I'd like to bring it up again, and that's just, again, looking at properties if there's any properties still in the Main Street area that are perhaps underutilized, or if there are anticipated changes coming where, for example, let's just say, hypothetically, a firehouse is going to be decommissioned or something, and it's going to create a potential developable area, or a scenario where someone comes in and purchases property that's one-story property on Main Street and says, I want to come in and build up 2 stories on top of this. I feel like we need to keep preparing ourselves for eventualities, and if looking at it reveals a concern that we could have an undesirable situation, then that would be a trigger for relooking at zoning. We've heard a lot of comments from the public about projects being too large on Main Street, that you're putting in kind of monolithic structures on a Main Street that's composed originally of a lot of individual lot buildings, cheek by jowl, with some neat details differentiating them for each other. I don't think we have anything in our toolkit to control the size of developments. And if that kind of gains momentum, where you have, like I said, if someone came in and bought a number of parcels that had the 1-story structure on Main Street and said, I'm going to build this all up to 3 stories, people's heads are going to explode in terms of what the visual impact is going to be and the level of change. And I don't feel like we're totally prepared for that eventuality, that we could get blindsided by it if it comes up on us faster than we expect. And there'll be no time at the point a project is being proposed to say, should we have tried to change zoning? Was there a desire on the part of the populace to do something different, but now it's like kind of too late? We're staring into the headlights.
I could just add one comment or observation. In my opinion, in addition to affordable housing, which obviously is an important long-term goal, I think, for consideration, I think our role as a board would be to sort of contemplate the future of our public space overall. And why do I say that? Because really that's we're the main arm that can do that. And this month I think is the anniversary of Olmsted's 200th birth, and there's a lot of events about his role in developing Central Park and parks. And it seems to me that a city needs to anticipate future development. So what would New York City be without Central Park if they didn't envision future development? And it seems to me that one of the things that we could do is to anticipate what Beacon would look like in 50 years, in 100 years, and where do we want to develop public space. In my opinion, it should be Main Street. Main Street should be strengthened in terms of a public access to the city, to the river and to the mountain. And basically the whole thing needs to be a stronger access of public space, I think in 100 years in the future.
We got 1 minute before we start.
Okay. A lot of communities are looking at no-build options as one of the alternatives to analyze when you're proposing like expensive or infrastructure things or other large developments. they should be compared against what the cost benefit is of either doing very small interventions or doing nothing. And that is sometimes really helps the decision-making process.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. We're going to start our official business here, but before we start the people's business, there's something I need to say. And it's to Etha. Today, for those of you who don't know, this is Etha's last planning board meeting. Thank you is such a shallow word when it comes to you, Etha, and what you have done for me personally, as my tenure on this board, for many of us members, and just for the city of Beacon. It is so difficult when you see a situation and sitting in a role and being afraid of it, which I was when I first came to this wonderful planning board. And I must say that you made this home. And it is with that deep, heartfelt thank you I say, although the words may seem shallow, I speak for myself. John and I were going back and forth, John Gunn, trying to figure out how do we put this to words, what can we say? And there aren't words to say when someone has been such a gracious part of this board and this community. But I do say from the board here, and I wanted to make sure it was in the records, and say thank you. No, you can, it's fine. But thank you.
You're still working.